Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the asynchronous classes for architectural sketching. So this past week, when I walked around taking a look at some of the sites that you have chosen for your architectural unbuilt project, I noticed that a lot of the sites were not necessarily urban in context. So some of them had, a number of them are actually within a kind of edge of city kind of large scale parking lot or a suburban backyard kind of setting that it's not necessarily a very, very dense condition. So I'm going to take the opportunity now, going a little bit out of order here, is looking at site. So we've talked about context in the past where the architecture that is adjacent to the building that is the subject matter in focus helps to create a setting in an urban environment. I'm going to take a little bit of time and focus on another project today, thinking about the site itself. So I'm still going to be illustrating the subject matter, of course, but I would say equally as important as the subject matter is the place that it sits to give it, to kind of ground it, because we can just draw a field and then place a box on top of it or whatever form it is as a piece of sculpture. But today I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these subtleties just to bring a sketch to life in a way that is more than just understanding perspective. So today we're going to take a look at this. This is Solstice, excuse me, by Jeannie Gang. So it obviously has an architectural form, but it also has a bit of landscaping, context, and different degrees and detail of trees. So we could start to see these are like very high level sidewalk trees here, a younger tree, and then another one in the foreground, which partially obstructs the building in focus. So in addition to the trees, there's also low plantings, and perhaps the image that I have here is harder to see, but I'll post it to Canvas so you'll see it just as well as I can. Low level plantings down here and off to the side, some grasses, ornamental grasses, some shrubs, and some smaller kind of groupings in the foreground between the drive and the sidewalk. So I'm going to run through, of course, the architecture here, but then also spending some time on the context in the site and how this building sits. So I'm going to work, of course, with structure, with the construction lines as I normally do. And then I'll probably get into a little bit of colored pencil just to kind of show how some of this can be differentiated in tone. And so the first thing here is, of course, we're going to lay out where we have that horizon line. And this is a Google Street View image. So the moment you start to lift the angle of the camera up, that third point really, really gets dramatically increased. So these are all vertical buildings, of course. So, and because I'm in illustrating the more of the foreground and the landscape and the site, I am going to autocorrect this so that the verticals are vertical in a landscape format. If I were looking all the way up this tower, which is maybe 20 stories or so, I might want to accentuate some of that verticality by looking back at that third point and drawing it like you see in this image. But I kind of cropped the top of this. And so I'm going to start with the architecture very lightly, knowing that a lot of it is going to be obstructed here. And then I'm going to come back, add that piece of landscape, or at least this tree, and then come back and kind of fill in the other sides, the other two sides, the bottom and then the right. So I'm just going to take this off to the side a little bit. Of course, you'll have this image on screen, or you could print it out as well. Uh, so I'm going to just start with, again, we have a low horizon line. And in this case, the one of the vanishing points is very, very far off to the right. The other one, if we look closely, and you can see indicators of it here, the joints in the concrete sidewalk, if you were to just continue those lines, there's actually a vanishing point right there. So just above this woman's head that's walking in the door, that's our line, our horizon line. So one of them is almost directly, just maybe a little bit off to the left of center. That's one of those points that we're looking at, but the other one, the one that's really setting up much more of the geometry here is well off to the right. So it is worth noting that there is a point here on our image on screen. There's very little reacting to that point. These on our neighboring building are reacting to it, so they're all vanishing to this point. I could just draw those really lightly in. So we will come back to that. So it's worth noting where that is. But the one that's really the driving force of this image, where all of these horizontal lines are converging, is, I don't know, a foot or so off to the right of my print. So I will come and reference this point, but only once I'm drawing the context off to the right. And also, in a small way, we're also referencing it in these joints that are all perpendicular to our point of view. Those are all going to this point as well. Okay, so as I've discussed before, the first thing to start off with is trying to get that first few edges in place that are consistent with the architecture and those angles. So we're flat, pretty close to the base of the horizon line here. That's going to set where our building meets grade. And then we're going to look at where, what is the center of our composition? The center is roughly here. So it's almost drawn for us. This vertical piece of expressed structure is prominently indicated here with a higher level of reflectivity. That is going to be roughly the center point of our composition. So, and again, I'm drawing these vertically. If you are more comfortable drawing it in the way that these are all kind of collapsing to that third point, you can do that. I try to accentuate things in a vertical nature when I'm looking at things using a portrait orientation. So in this case, I'm not going to accentuate it because it's kind of contradictory to the format. One of the last lectures of the semester, I'll be talking about three-point perspective. I've touched on it from time to time in this course, but I feel that it's more important to kind of be comfortable with two-point perspective before moving on to the third point. And so now here again, referencing angles, trying to match angles as close as possible. We can start to lay out. And the other thing here with this building is it kicks out. There's this geometry of a kind of, straight vertical, and then it kicks back, and then there's a terrace, and then it comes back again. So these are all relatively parallel to one another, coplanar in a way that they all have that angle. But again, you'll have to use your best judgment and match that, because those are not going to be places that we can easily identify for vanishing points. So just looking at proportion here, we're going to map this out. And this building is actually a series of, it's a pattern. It really has vertical faces like checkerboard patterns back and forth with intermittent spacings of this kind of canted wall of between infill. So I'm going to keep going with those horizontals that are all collapsing to a point in the distance. So here you could actually start to see the relationship. You want to, as you go up in a very, very tall building, these will start to grow closer and closer together the further up you get. So you can start to indicate them being slightly closer to one another. But it's subtle here because we're only really looking at the bottom few floors of this tower. It's just remembering that as you go higher, that are all collapsing to the same point, so they're going to start to flare out. That angle starts to lift up. And so those are reference points, and hopefully, just so for the sake of construction lines, I'm drawing them a little bit heavier than I normally would, but that's for you to be able to see that on screen. And so, and then it's interesting in the architecture here, Jeannie Yang has alternated this geometry so you can carry that up. It's every other floor is behaving in the same manner. And then this is where that kickback happens, where the canted wall is returning. And then again on this, the same. Always remember the thickness of the slab edge cover as well. It looks like there's actually the entry point to these terraces is right about looking like this. So it's a recessed, probably into a door that is in a small little alcove that you can access. And then there is a glass guardrail. Which is very, very light because it's just glass panels with posts for infill. And then each one of these is actually a two-story space. So there's going to be a mullion, two vertical mullions within that, one horizontal. And then there's also going to be a mid-span mullion at the floor line between two floors on this section as well. Everyone has two vertical mullions. So it's really a pattern. It's kind of just emulating what that pattern is. You repeat it. And then down here, the ground floor is actually maybe a story and a half. That, in that case, the horizontal mullion is lifted up about a third off the top of that curtain wall, or it might be window wall, but it's really at the extreme high end of what a window wall can do. So anyway, so then remember that there's always going to be that depth of that metal panel. It's going to have thickness that's probably about 2.5 feet. And then again, that pattern replicates itself on the other side of this, which carries through. This is a kind of consistent banding that wraps up the building. Yikes. And then again, this is going to be now, we're coming closer to looking at we're coming closer to this vanishing point. So things are flattening out. So of course, everything, if you took this building in elevation, you wouldn't see these diagonals at all because, you're just looking straight at each one of them. So as you're looking more obliquely at this image, you can see that angle. But then as you come closer and closer to the point here, they flatten out. So you're looking at almost an elevation as you get to this point. So again, the midspan, the 2 mullion. And now we're getting to this, there's a recessed point. This is where the entry happens. The curtain wall is right here for the entry condition. You could see a recessed structural condition. There appears to be a swing door here, and then there's a revolver. And now the revolver is going to be very, very low profile. We can hardly even see that it's curved. So there's a side swing door, and then we're seeing the underside. So this is going to end up being in shadow. The underside, that's a recess, kind of like a small bit of enclosure for that. Now, by the time I get over here, like I had mentioned a moment ago, we're getting so close to that point that we're now losing that that canted wall is flattening out. So now we're actually seeing this. It's flat, and then it's going to actually start to splay out in the opposite direction. And you can see that. So here's that angle, and now we're getting tighter and tighter. It becomes vertical, and then it would actually start to go kicking out the opposite direction. This image is, and I think that if you've spent any time flying around Google Street View, the way your field of vision is very, very wide, and you can see that it doesn't arc. So if you have a very, very wide field of vision, and photographers do this a lot, they autocorrect it so that all the horizontal lines are perfectly straight. I don't know what kind of camera that Google uses, but you can see that the angle here is different than the angle on this side because they're vanishing in different ways. Or I'm seeing one face of this wall, and then so I'm seeing like the west face of this wall here, and here I'm seeing the east face of this wall. So there is some differences, and this is all going to get blurred a bit. When I come back and start adding some of those branches, you're not really going to sense the same geometry shift. But this starts to get flat, more flat, and then a railing. And it still has that mid-span mullion. So one way you can accentuate this in the perspective drawing is that you can either add different levels of tone to that to make it appear as though it's uh, really looking like it's angled a bit differently. So like in the image, you could see all these truly vertical faces are bright. And then you could see the difference here between the vertical face and the slab edge cover, which is sloping, aligned with like these two edges are coplanar, and then it goes vertically again. So the vertical ones in this case are much more brightly illuminated. They're more reflected because they're picking up more of the sun in the sky, whereas these other pieces that are canted outward are reflecting more of the ground, which is of course darker. Even though the panels are probably the same gray tone, they just reflect light differently. Okay, so I can keep going here. My verticals again are vertical. That's part of the kind of illusion here where if I were to take this wall and make it vertical like it actually is, you would see more of how that canted wall does change from one side to the other. But the way Google does things, I'm really emphasizing that third point in perspective. But here I have gotten rid of it. And so my drawing is going to end up looking a little bit different than the way the Google photo looks. And I'm going to just kind of let this bleed off to the side now, knowing that I'm going to come back and start adding that the tree in the foreground is going to obstruct most of what I draw from this side of the entry to the left. So often, like I had mentioned before, with context and things that we see, we don't always want to draw everything that might detract from the main idea of the building. I'm actually going to keep the sign for Solstice, which is this in the foreground. I don't think it's a very unappealing sign. It seems like something that could actually help the drawing to have some idea of foreground along with the tree. So now I want to look at how this drop off is working. What's the geometry there? I could see that it tucks back behind the sign. It kind of runs parallel to the front face, and then it starts to curve. And by the time it's perpendicular to the road, it's just past that face of the building. So just past. And then there's this median that comes out right about like this. There's a very short space between the sign and the parkway. I'm just gonna run like this. And then I know that there's a corner here. I don't see all of it, and it's not that important to capture it, so it's okay. You can actually complete that if you have room on your sheet. I don't have it, and it's not critical to the drawing, so I'm not gonna. Right away, as I drew this line, it's even more evident as I look at the screen, which I'm projecting to, I can see that I got a little sloppy there. I could see that one long line. Often it's good in this case to take a straight edge because that if I went ahead with that and that line ended up being quite crooked or it has a little kink in it, you'd really notice that. So now I've got the drive, the sign. I'm going to just come back here and indicate there's going to be a tree here. That's the one that it's kind of the young planted tree recent. And now I'm gonna also look at, there's some trees in the background here, these kind of parkway trees. Looks like there's about two of them and they're quite tall. They have a large trunk that's reaching up in front of this older building. And that other building is going to react to this vanishing point, like I mentioned earlier. So this is going to be coming up quite a bit. And this building is a pre-war building. It's all punched openings. I don't want to spend a lot of time counting windows or really much of that at all. You can't, some people find this kind of stuff therapeutic. You want to, sit back and just, instead of watching TV, you could draw windows. That's totally up to you. I will not be drawing windows as much as I enjoy doing this. It's not my number one thing in life. So I actually draw just guidelines. These are kind of like the base of every level. And then it's not to say I'm going to be drawing an all glass building. This is just for my reference. So then I would come across later and start adding just enough. I might just kind of indicate a few places where I would add those windows. But again, most of these windows are going to be obstructed by some of the landscape in that foreground. Actually, something is, I want to kind of shorten this up a little bit more. I'm due for a new kneaded eraser. Mine's looking a little dark. Eventually it will start not erasing so well, and some of you may have already noticed that. Sure does come in handy though when you're sketching indoors. All right, so again, if you want, referencing that point, you can actually start to draw in some of those joints within the sidewalk, those control joints. The width of the sidewalk, of course, gets wider as you get towards you, so that gets flattened out as you move further away from the source of the photo, the photographer. And then there's a curb cut in the foreground here, which has a goofy, these rocks, so I don't know why they place these rocks here. It's almost like just to make sure that people don't drive off the side of the road. And so, oh, if you decide to go off the road, it's going to hurt your car. So we can put these rocks here. I don't like how those look. I'm not a landscape architect, but I'm not going to draw those. And nor am I going to draw like this is the kind of like, oh, there's pesticide that's been treated on this yard, so they put these little temporary signs, and then some other small sign. I don't want to draw that either. And for that matter, I'm not going to draw these two planters, these box planters. That is not really an important element in this composition. So now at this point, I have the basics of the site. The last thing that I want to focus on before getting into the foreground tree is looking at this. This is several different types of plants that are kind of grouped. The first one appears to be, actually, before I go into that, there's a buffer zone here. There's actually, it appears to be a walkway that kind of takes you from the sidewalk to the front door. There's a series of low plants here, kind of grasses, and then a little bit higher planted area that, and this appears to be red, and then another series of low plantings here that might be kind of like a pea gravel or a small stone patch that this is also replicated here. There's another kind of monument sign that's sticking up. And then, so I'm trying to just break this into manageable chunks, different places. So I have maybe 5 different places of low plantings here. Excuse me. I mentioned this because when looking at site, it's important to make things look realistic enough, but not as though you're going to draw every single piece, every plant, every leaf. And I'm going to go through this quickly because, we're architects. We don't spend a lot of time looking at landscapes or at least focusing on them. And so I just try to rationalize things into like groupings. Those groupings can then be create it more three-dimensionally through shade and shadow. We've talked about that before, creating a kind of taking something that looks complicated and seemingly random into a simple shape that has ins and outs around a profile edge. And then you could even see here one side is shaded darker than the other. The underside of the canopy of these trees is, of course, darker than the top, which receives more direct light. So if I now have these kind of groupings, this kind of outline that the extent of this tree, I can go back and then start to sculpt that in and out. So the branches are reaching out and then they come back in. And I'm just making this up. I'm not looking at what I see in the photo here. I'm just kind of the idea behind all the branches that are reaching out. And then, some of those branches will become visible into the canopy of the tree. So it's not just a trunk and then a grouping of leaves and branches that you cannot see. Often you'll see just the idea of some of those branches become visible within the canopy. And the same goes for this. In and out, you kind of just move in and out from that shape that you've identified as being the kind of mass. So this kind of vertical oval, it's like almost a columnar tree these are quite a bit different. They're more spread apart outward, although they have quite a bit of verticality too. This is much more vertical than it is horizontal. Okay, so then the next thing, and I'm going to come back to all these once I get into my more final line work. The next thing is looking at this. And so this is a tree that is really obstructing my building that I'm focusing on. So in a way, you could think of it as an obstruction, or it could be framed. You can move it. So if you really want to capture this element, the entry and everything above it, there is no reason that you cannot move this. No one, and there is really no reason that you should be drawing the landscape in a way that obstructs your building in a bad way. You can draw this in 100 different ways. One of them could just be a simple profile and then a light tone on top of it, and you could draw the entire building behind it. So you can just know, there's a tree there, but it's not obstructing your building much at all. You're basically looking through it. I am not very confident on some of the entourage that I use when it comes to people, and I sometimes they work out and sometimes they don't. But when I was doing my thesis project, I did all hand-drawn perspective drawings, and I did put people in them, but what I actually did was cut out silhouettes of people in trace and then glued them on with glue sticks so you can't see the glue. Like if you use Elmer's or something, that would be a very bad decision because you would see the glue, but the very subtle minimal amount of glue for trace can actually be applied to heavier stock paper, and you can't see the glue, but the silhouette of the person is all that matters. One of my criticisms of computer generated renderings is that you put lifelike people in there. The lighting on them is incorrect based on the lighting source that you have on the building. They're just like snipped people that are just placed there. They don't get the same kind of lighting as the rest of your building. And the faces are lifelike, so you immediately look at their faces. You draw too much attention to the people in the image as who is this? Is this a man? Is this a woman? Do they look like someone I know? What is their face? How are they feeling? It should be not that at all. It's more about just the activity of human beings around a building, not what the light of them is and how they behave. But that's just one of my critiques of the way people place some of their objects in space. It's most apparent with people, cars and trees and things like that doesn't draw your eye to as much, but as humans, we're drawn to human forms and faces. So, like here, this person's probably so tiny that you can't see their face anyway, so this is okay. But sometimes someone might put a person like this big and you could see their face. And so that's, ugh, no, don't do that. Silhouettes, that's really the best. Anyway, I digress. So place that tree where you want. Do you really want the branch that reaches out furthest to the right to be right at that point of that vertical element that we had drawn that really comes all the way vertically through the entire building? Or do you want to pull it back? Feel like you have the control about this within the composition of your drawing. I'm going to just really start with this is kind of the edge of where I want my tree to be. I want to be able to see a part of this bay and I want to be able to see the ground entry condition. The trick with drawing trees in the foreground is it can be very, very difficult to do too much and spend too much time drawing every branch and every leaf. And again, it shouldn't be the kind of thing that you spent, 90% of your drawing on something that isn't your architecture. So it's easier to kind of go off into the distance and draw things like this with less detail because, you could do pointillism for every little leaf, but of course we're not going to do that either. So first thing is establish an edge. Say, okay, I can go around this, I can go over this line and be ahead of it and behind this line, but I don't want to start going crazy. Like my photo says that my branches leaves come all the way out to here. I want to pull it back. I want to say this is going to be roughly where the edge of my tree exists. And now in order to make this lifelike, decisions have to be made. And immediately I can see some of the larger branches and how they're behaving. You could see if I were to kind of distill this into the most simple edges, these branches, the kind of a V here, another one down here, and then so maybe 3 or 4 branches in groupings. Think about different groupings of branches and leaves. Over time, you develop a style for this kind of thing, and you don't even need to look at what the tree is. You just know that there is a tree of a certain scale and a certain location relative to your object, and so you just draw what you know works. And so I first come in with where I'm going to start locating some of these branches. And they can be, referencing what you have seen in the drawing or in the photograph. But so these are going to be the primary branches that come into the side of my page. As branches get smaller, they tend to um, branch out, of course, smaller and smaller until they get to a small groupings of leaves, but they tend to kind of become more straight. And then the further they get away from the trunk they go, they become a little bit more delicate and they turn more. So you could even do a wintertime view and not show leaves at all here, but I'm going to just from what I've got already set up, just come in and draw groupings of what will become leaves. And so, I mentioned this too, I'm spending time on this because the sites that I saw from on Friday, it looks as though landscaping will help to it'll make your images appear more lifelike. If you were to draw a perspective I don't know, one of the sites was in Fox Point, and one of the dwelling units in the backyard of an existing home. It's a very leafy suburb. And if you just draw the buildings, it will look very foreign to that place. It won't look like the place that it actually is sited. So I'm just taking this opportunity to show drawing landscape elements at different scales in one drawing. So often, and you've probably heard me mention this before, is that the foreground elements, whether it's in the base condition or the trees, having different levels of background, midground, foreground that can help to lead your eye into an image, and it makes it more rich. You feel like you're close to something and far from other things. So this is where I am with where I can start with. This is kind of like the base. So I've got my first where I want the edge of this to be. You can see I'm coming in and out of that element. It's not just as simple as drawing a sphere, like if you were to draw, that's a tree, and then, I could shade part of it. It doesn't really look much like a tree, but it looks like a lollipop. That's where you have to start using that as a guide and then just coming in more and more. So the next thing is groupings of leaves. So just little tick marks like this. There are edges that you can create. Just the idea of that there are little bits of leaves and branches and groupings that come together. The other one I do is the kind of clover leaf, the branches and the leaves that kind of come out in groups like this. So there's the tick marks that kind of create the idea of a grouping, a line of leaves, and then the other one is that kind of the clover leaf. And they can go together. I don't know anything about trees. All I know is they have lots of branches and lots of leaves. And I try to create a lifelike foreground. If I have a tree in the foreground, I don't want it to look as though I just totally ignored it. And again, you could take this as far as you want. You could draw every branch and every leaf. You could spend a month drawing this to make it look like a photo. But for a sketch where I want to only spend an hour on the sketch to really drive home this idea of a lifelike composition that makes something more than just a building on a blank piece of paper, this is how that can be done. So I can do one of two things here. Because this is so heavy on landscape and the foreground and the trees, I could take a soft approach to the landscape, whether it's graphite or colored pencil. I can lighten up things that I don't want to see anymore. So at this point, if I have that arc in the background, I can lighten that up so you don't see it at all. I could clean up some of these geometry lines and construction lines. So I think one interesting thing here is the juxtaposition between this really rigid geometric straight lines surrounded by the context of this very green and airy kind of landscape that is surrounding it. So I think that what I'm going to try to do here, and of course, the media that you use, maybe you want to use your watercolors for this. This might be a good opportunity for that. Uh, and maybe now that I mention it, maybe I should have done that. But what I'm going to do here, just to really show how you can utilize different media to emphasize different pieces, I am going to use pen and a little heavy. I'm not going to go to Micron today. I'm going to use my Pilot fine liner, and I'm going to go in and with a kind of heavy hand, I'm going to come in and make the architecture that I want to focus on heavy. And then when I get to the landscape, I'm going to come back to that with colored pencil and a soft approach to it. So you will always see the building as being more prominent than the landscape, even though the landscape is closer to you, especially this tree, and it'll be in color. So that's going to be another little bit of a change. So just going across all of my construction lines here, emphasizing as I go. One other thing that I tend to do is you can vary line weight. So let's say you know that there's something down here. I pick up my pen so that you're seeing a line there, but it's a broken line. It's not as solid as all the rest. It's jumping up and down a little bit. That's another trick that I use to kind of indicate a light line weight without changing my lines. Because right now I only have this one type of line. So here again, as I come to the tree, I don't want to go back and forth, back and forth. I'm going to keep my Pilot fine liner here. And I know that I'm going to have groupings of branches or leaves here. So I'm just going to do the same thing. I kind of pick up my pen, I jump across things. I know that I could come back and add those branches in. It's kind of just a trick that I do. You don't have to do this, but I just tend to lift up kind of like there's going to be something breaking the line once I get to the tree there. And since I planned for it, I know that's going to be coming. Yeah. So I'm going to stick to using my ink for straight line work, the architecture, and then I'm going to come back with softer lines, maybe graphite color pencil for those elements that are in the landscape. These are the balcony railings. You could actually come back and after you've got all the hard lines done, you could come back and add to really get shade and shadow, you know how the vertical faces can be treated a little bit differently in tone. You could come back and add some of that later to really indicate the difference in the vertical nature of some of these pieces of glass and then the sloping nature of some of the others. So this building is really a pattern. So once you've got that form, those building blocks down, it's easy to kind of just come back and fill it in. I don't count the millions. I'm just trying to make things appear as though they're somewhat evenly spaced. Here again, I'm getting to this point where I know that I'm getting some of the architecture in the background here the way that I want it. I can see it, but it's getting interrupted. I got to make decisions. How much of this base am I going to show? How much of that is going to be cut off or obstructed by the landscape, this tree? I still want to be able to show it though. I don't want this just to suddenly go from a few little branches to suddenly nothing. Like I can't just blot, I'm sorry, blotch out everything like a big ink stain that just happened to come across here. So without getting too much detail here, I'm going to wrap up the architecture. This is going to be near the end of what I want to show. You can see, so the building kind of falls away. Just indicate a little bit in the distance. Okay, so then the other thing I can show is like the extent of the sidewalk. The place where like a grass or a landscape edge comes in contact with a hardscape, if I'm looking through the grass, I do this kind of jagged line. In the distance, the curb edge is a straight line that curves down. That's okay. So I've got with one pen, that's just with my Pilot fine liner, the base of what I want. I have, and I think this was early on when we were talking about using color pencil. I have, I say olive green and dark green. Quite frankly, I can't often tell the difference between them, but I have these two greens at my disposal, so I'm gonna use just using pressure, and I can also highlight. There's some reds in here, so I could even do that. Like I have my terracotta that can come in handy, but again, I'm going to use this very, very subtly. I'm not going to push very hard. I don't want the landscape to take away much from the architecture. And so even this building in the distance, this is kind of the pre-war building, it kind of has a yellow effect to it. The problem here is going to be that the building that I'm focusing on, the Genie Gang Solstice Tower, is gray, and the curtain wall is a kind of bluish green, depending on where you're looking at the reflectivity in the glass. So the one thing that I want to stay away from is drawing too much attention again to the landscape. I'm just trying to draw enough of it to give the illusion that it's there and that I am sighting this building in a way that is toward the ground. I cannot ignore the fact that there are landscape elements here. So again, with the side of my colored pencil, I am just highlighting with a little bit of force on one side that would be in shade. And interestingly enough, there is quite a bit of yellow I can also see in this landscape. So, wow, oh my goodness. As I see how this is rendered on screen, it looks a lot darker than the way I can see it. Well, are all the colors that saturated? Right. Anyway, all right, so I'm gonna just very lightly come back. And I don't even need to really erase any of those construction lines because they're gray. I don't want to emphasize too much of the edges here that as compared to in the architecture of the building and focus. But I do want to make sure that I'm able to indicate edges without too much of that just kind of wisping away into nothing. So here again, the side of my, you can do this in graphite. You could do also a hard edge. If you just want to do an ink drawing, that's fine too. But the key there, if you're doing an ink drawing, is not to overemphasize the detail of all of these little branches and things, and then use the same amount of detail on your focused building. So I'm just lightly indicating, following some of those lines that I had created, and then just very, very lightly coming back off the page or off the side here of the image. And I can always go back and add some more line weight if I want to emphasize something a little bit more. Maybe you lose some of those construction lines as you go on top of them. So you can always go back and get more definition on edges as you would like, as much as appropriate without drawing too much attention. I don't want to spend, and I'm doing this more slowly as I explain it. Normally I would kind of cruise through this, but uh, there have been students who have been wanting to know more about landscape or drawing site like this, so I want to make sure that I touch on it. And you can use your indigo blue or just the edge of the graphite pencil to show shadow groupings of branches that would create or cast shadow on spaces down below. That's really it. So if you want to really emphasize something in the foreground, you can come back and add that edge. Or you can just let the drawing itself kind of bleed off to the side, like the colored portion kind of fade off. Now I'm going to come back here and add a little bit more to this context building. And like I had mentioned before, I don't want to spend time drawing every window, but I want to just, again, I don't want to draw little squares and fill them in. I'm just going to use the side of my pencil again. And because I have those guidelines, they're helping to establish the relationships between floors, a kind of grid. Not count, you can of course count if you want. I don't want to spend time doing that. I can't imagine anyone would be looking at this and say, wait a minute, that building, I know it, and it has 14 windows across, not 12. So I'm just quickly going across, and I'm not even going to fill in the whole thing. It's going to just kind of fade the windows, and and then I can even come back and pick it up again. This is kind of the trick with a lot of context buildings. If you don't want to draw them all, don't do it. It's, there you go. That's it. I don't want to spend the time on that, and it shouldn't be the focus. I don't want to draw attention. And the same thing I can just use when another side here. You can always come back and add more tone to this, more three-dimensional aspects to it, however much, but just remember, we don't want that to take focus over the primary source image. And I'm going to come back and actually add a little bit of tone here because this is going to be my face in the shadow. Actually, this building has a kind of a monumental base condition. It comes down to grade, or there's a sidewalk here, and it has some larger openings, like maybe 2.5 stories or so that come down. And then I'm going to just give that a little bit of a wash to kind of show that that's all in shadow as well. Okay, so I can then, again, whenever you do those washes, you kind of lose some of those edges. You can bring those back, just following some of this you've already set up. Maybe you want to show some of those branches. So this is an example of drawing a tree that's maybe 30, 40, 50 feet away from you, up to 100 feet, look like this. After that, they become more kind of like a background screen. You don't really see too much definition in them. There's this monumental sign in the foreground. It's just gray. So now, if I want to do now, remember I did these kind of 5 or 6 groupings in the foreground. I'm going to just go quickly with the idea this is kind of grasses. So this is kind of a wispy, really quick motion with the pencil. And there, that's just, grasses. Another grouping back here. This looks like a more solid, low planted bush. So that would just be something like this. And then again, all plants and trees have different densities and different shades of color, but just to really show that there are groups, that's all that really matters. And then the one that kind of draws your attention is this one that has a kind of red to it. And after I draw these things, I always come back and add a place where they sit. So there's a shadow, there's an edge that either it's dirt or gravel or something that shows that that's seated on something. I'm afraid to look at how saturated it is when I look at the screen. So there's this. Then here again, there's another grouping of what looks to be kind of red behind others of. So now we're getting really into foreground stuff here. Remember that each one of these would get sighted on the ground. So I create a small dash of a kind of shadow that it's casting. And also I come back and just add a little bit of tone to one side to show that there is a side that's in shade, darker than the others. Okay, so then now I'm going to come back and think about how do I really want to emphasize how much do I want to give this life? How much do I want to make this more tonal? So one thing is you could start by adding tone to everywhere in the building. You could come back, you could render this out, shade, shadow, however you want to color that. And then, but you have to remember that if you want this to appear as though it's lifted off the screen or the page, you want to be able to respect this. So it might be worth doing some of this first. And I'll show you that you might think, oh, these are a lot of leaves. This is a lot of stuff. I don't want to have to come back and do all this. So just moving my pencil really fast, looking at those lines that I've already set up, and I'm only showing interesting. I'm only going to be indicating the leading edge of these as being colored the leaves that I've already created. As I get further away from my source image, I can make these lines, these fields of color, less and less dense. They're fading away because the important part is how these reach out into my image here. And eventually they just become fields of color. And now the amount of pressure that you put on your pencil or color, that in this case, or if it's watercolor, they just start to lighten up. They become more of a field, but they become lighter. So you're kind of grouping these lines together more. They come closer and closer together until eventually you have a very, very light field of color in the back. And you can differentiate this only simply by applying more pressure on the pen or pencil. But again, this is a sketch. We're not interested in every leaf, everything that has to go into this. We're just looking at the lines that we've set up and then just creating some more field very, very lightly. And that is really all that you need to create this idea of something in the foreground. Then you could come back and just emphasize those few branches that you've set up from the beginning. Like that. So that's really the extent of the quick ideas behind landscape and adding some of these things to a drawing to make it look as though it's cited in a context that you might use for your drawing of drawing the unbuilt. You can always come in and add more, but again, I don't want this to become the focal point. So once I come in now, I can return now to this building that I've already drawn adding more tone to it. I could keep going with indigo blue and black. That's my kind of go-to for creating shadow. So to remember that I'm again going to be looking at these ideas of what's receiving daylight or sunlight and what is not, to be consistent with some of that. So for in this case, part of this is going to be it's going to be receiving some of that shadow from the canopy above, that overhang. And so I mentioned earlier that this face, I'm just going to render this really, really quickly, that is going to receive quite a bit of darker treatment, those pieces that are angled down. And I could come back and add line weights to this as well. Now here, I still want to, I'm gonna, like I did the opposite. So I have darkest of the landscape, it fades out. I want to do the same here. Now I'm gonna start fading back. So I'm gonna lose some of that definition of the trees and branches here, but that's okay because it's kind of going back and forth. If you lose some of the definition, you can always come back and add it back. You could just apply more pressure to your pencil there that allows you to see more of the definition of the tree in the foreground. It's back and forth. You don't want to overdo something and then have a difficult time trying to undo it. Okay, so now I've got part of my building here that I've got one level of tone to it. And now just by changing orientation or just lightening up the pressure on my pencil, I can start to look at ways to show that vertical face a little bit differently, a little bit lighter. Going quickly through this just so that you can see one way of rendering it. I'm actually gonna, I could leave those metal panels just white. Maybe that's the emphasis that I'm making that really light. Or I could even come back and add just a little bit of yellow here, very, very lightly to show that that metal panel is in fact reflecting sunlight. And it might even build up on some of the contrast. If you emphasize one corner, one edge, that profile edge might be the one to emphasize. And I think that it might be worthwhile. I'm coming back in with a heavier edge. So now I've got this is the Papermate. I don't know if I indicated this as being one that I use, but I'm going to just come back and add a little bit more of a profile edge to this. Including where the balconies are. Now, if you've gone through this whole process and Ryan, I lost what I had here. You can go back and add some of that definition again to this tree. Just like anywhere that you see a little bit something missing, you want to just make that pop a little bit more. This is the opportunity to do that. The tone of the that you've created with green, you just have to come back and find those edges and make them come back to life by giving those. I'm not going to do that with color now. I want to try to get this thing to really show as if it's in the foreground. So I want to get those edges to come forward. Just as I did here, the profile edges, each one of these, I want to do the same too, but I don't want to do it all the way back. I just want to show that edge coming out. as it comes to the edge of in relation to the building. It got a little bit messy here. You can see I'm using it that very, very soft. It's like a 6B, very difficult if you and I'm working fast, trying to talk as I go. So sometimes I end up with these messy drawings. But here, while I'm having fun with color, I can actually come back and write in the spacey font that they've got here. And while I'm having fun with color, I might as well take it up. Sometimes you've probably seen me do this. I take the sky and kind of add a little bit to it to make it offset from the foreground. And I do like to use graphite to my advantage when I can move it, but with this I can't. So I have to be very gentle with the amount of pressure that I'm applying to this so that I can make this appear as though it's getting lighter and lighter as I get further away from the horizon. Oh, and I could also use the side of my pencil to indicate, many of you, good thing I mentioned this, you'll have grass. A lot of your sites have a grass field or a backyard or something. If you use your color pencil and you just use the side of it, you can create a very simple gradient. And with the texture of the paper it shows through, you can just with minimal amount of effort there really show an idea of some kind of a grass plane without filling in, don't use the point of your pencil here. So now it's almost like using the graphite, you can of course continuously add to it and really show more and more contrast. So one of the great things about this design is that there are these deep recesses. Those recesses would be getting the corner there. You can really set that off by making it appear darker than it's the adjacent surfaces. Even here where I don't see it very well, it's obstructed. I still want to show a little bit of that. Just trying to add a little bit of life to that foreground. That's why I do this. Try to add depth. I sometimes call it noise. It's kind of like the things that make surfaces look not so pristine. And again, coming back and just if you see an edge that you just feel like you want to amp up a little bit, you come back and you add a little bit more to it. Like for instance, here I could start to see that there's, a column back here. I don't want that to compete with my line work that I've already created. I'm not going to make, so because it's in the distance, I'm not going to show it with as much intensity with the black. You could even show interior spaces with just a little bit of intent, edge of the wall beyond. There might be some pieces of furniture back here that you can just kind of show in suggestive tone. So I hope that this has been helpful for those of you that are going to be utilizing some of these landscaped elements in your own drawings. How to make something look like, an abstraction of something that's very detailed, and it might be very difficult to kind of start. You might want to just draw every little leaf, every little bit, and then eventually you've spent 2 hours drawing something that you don't even really want to focus on. In this way, we're just focusing on enough to really get the idea of it, not necessarily draw it with such attention that it takes away from our subject matter. And you can always just massage this to no end, how much time do you really want to invest in it? Do you want to really make that more and more detailed? Don't spend so much time that it competes with your subject image here. So, I think that that's as far as I would want to take this. I don't really want to dwell on it more than that. I think that this gives you a good idea of just really suggestive ways of grouping things, plants, whether there could be 10 or 12 in each one of these groups or just individual pieces down here. Um, Drawing those trees in the background with just enough definition to show that they kind of the believable way that they might actually take shape. And then in the foreground as well. So, and kind of leading your eye from the foreground to the background, and then your subject matter takes the most attention. So I think that I'm going to wrap it up now, and I hope that this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing your rendition of The Solstice by Jeannie Gang. Uh, yeah. This will be due a week from Wednesday. So we'll be having our normal class this Friday, and we'll talk more about landscape and site, primarily site. In this case, there's a driveway, there's signage, there's trees, foreground, background. This week on Friday, there'll be the in-class tutorial, which is I can't even remember the name. One of the not Sana. Forgive me for not recalling. I have it posted on Canvas, so as soon as I post it, I guess it's out of sight, out of mind. Anyway, we will be looking at oh, of course, it's Maggie's Center by Richard Rogers. It's a very, very small project that actually won the Sterling Prize in 2008, and kind of elevational in the photo, but it does have again a similar type of landscape element that will help us to kind of get more familiar and comfortable with the landscape and trees, small shrubbery, bushes, and things like that. So looking forward to that, and we will be only in person for another 2 classes, really. That's this Friday, and then in 2 weeks, the Friday after, or 2 Fridays after Thanksgiving. So thank you again for listening, and I look forward to seeing your rendition of the solstice. Thanks, everyone.